wanted to talk a little bit about Musk's purchase of Twitter and all of the noise that's surrounding it and some historic perspective. The main perspective that I bring to this is my shared enthusiasm for space settlement, combined with my leading role in the early establishment of freedom of speech on the internet. When I say early, I mean 1982. You can find an essay that I wrote titled Videotex and the American Pioneer, which I wrote while I was the futures architect for AT&T and Knight Ridder News Services experiment with mass market networking that they held in Miami, Florida. That service went live in 1983. You can find a Slashdot article about it, which asks the question, why didn't the internet take off in 1983? You'll find a comment under there by a pseudonym, Balderson, which is me. It's my well-known pseudonym. Everyone knows that's who I am. It's not anonymous. Describing some of the background. Earlier than my participation in that very early experiment in mass market access to putting forth people's speech on the internet, I had been interested by the O'Neill vision of space colonization, which had been described in the Whole Earth Catalog. I was somewhat enamored of the Whole Earth Catalog and that subculture as part of the Back to the Land movement that was in place that sort of got lost along with the other counterculture ideas that related more to the nation of settlers than to a lot of the identity politics that came later. The Back to the Land movement was reflected in the origin of the Plato Network when Seymour Cray and Bill Norris started Control Data Corporation and beat IBM's army of engineers to the first supercomputer, based upon Seymour Cray taking off to his farm in Wisconsin, Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, and having a group of about 34 people, only one of which was a PhD, develop the first supercomputer, the 6600, Cyber 6600, that was used as the basis of the Plato Network, which was an early form of social networking, originally intended for education. Bill Norris grew up on a farm in Nebraska, very solidly part of the nation of settlers. In World War II, he took off and did some work in cryptography. But when he came back, he established Control Data Corporation. Control Data Corporation made a lot of money with government contracts, national labs, etc. But in 1977, Bill Norris came forth with an idea that he wanted to address the dangers of nuclear war, although he didn't say that explicitly in his essays about this. He wanted to have a back to the land movement based upon technology. Computer networking was an important aspect of that. He wanted to have more decentralized population to try to avert the dangers of nuclear war, a danger that we're now facing as a result of the abuse of the computer networks to create swarms that are politically out of control and creating a confrontation with Russia and the Ukraine that seems to be ratcheting only in one direction, escalation, with no one to negotiate with for de-escalation. This after decades of centralizing population in the cities in the United States and elsewhere that Norris tried to avert This was one of the things that attracted me to the Plato Network when I went to work as a system programmer prior to working for AT&T and NetRaider on their experiment with the early internet. Unfortunately, the Wall Street press saw the threat of a back to the land movement supported by one of the largest supercomputer companies with very early social networking as being a cultural threat to the direction they wanted to go. The financial press character assassinated William Norris, and I was there working on a mass market version of the Plato Network to try to realize one aspect of his vision. When I was offered the position by AT&T to be their futures architect in Miami, I took the job because of the fact that the financial press and Wall Street had successfully undermined Norris's authority within Control Data Corporation to the point that it would no longer be possible to achieve the mass market penetration that we had demonstrated technically could be achieved with an economic system. $40 per month at the time would have provided you with a Macintosh-like interface, a 512 by 512 bitmap display with a touch panel and a modem going into a central system that would provide you with graphics and services, email, games, etc. In fact, one of the games that I developed, Space Sim, is largely recognized as one of the first virtual realities that was ever developed in a wide area network. So when I went to Miami to work on the mass market system, I was very interested in the settler culture of the United States being protected from what I saw as a financial press that was hostile to the settler culture of the United States. That's why I wrote the essay there called Videotex, Networking, and the American Pioneer. In that essay, I outlined the future of computer networking as it related to culture. I saw the centralized control of ideas in mass market, mass media, as representing the values of the kinds of people that are able and very motivated to take control of centralized power. This kind of mentality is anathema. It's in opposition to a pioneering or positive sum aspect of culture. The mass market or the mass media that had been dominating the culture of the United States during most of the 20th century at that time was poisoning the foundation of the country and making the pioneer culture, the settler culture of the United States, engage in a lot of self-loathing. This is particularly true of the boomers, my generation. And this is one of the reasons why the boomer generation is reviled by a lot of the people that have come after them, both on the left and the right, but mainly on the right. So one of the things that I described in that essay, Videotex, Networking, and the American Pioneer, was the fact that when pioneers are able to get in touch with each other and bypass these centralized media control operations, they will discover that they were not alone. They were not as isolated as they thought they were. And that this would cause a major disruption in the body politic of the United States in particular. It turned out that it didn't happen as soon as I had hoped. It happened to some extent, but it didn't really come into very obvious manifestation until Donald Trump was elected. At that point, another thing that I wrote about in that same essay was the danger that deregulation of the networks could result in monopolistic control of the content of ideas that were being transmitted across the network, and that such deregulation needed to be tempered by dealing with all of the service providers as common carriers. Common carrier is basically like a phone company. A phone company doesn't censor what you say in your phone conversations. If they do censor what you say, they can be held liable. They're no longer a common carrier, they're a publication. What I didn't count on in that essay was that there would be this thing called the Section 230 provision that would protect even monopolies from any kind of liability if they started censoring people. Section 230 was originally intended to, as a kind of redundant protection of content providers on the network, so that they would not be held liable for the content, for the comments of the people on their bulletin boards, blogs, etc. That was really unnecessary if they would simply be classified as a common carrier and did not censor. But nevertheless, they passed that, and this resulted in those kinds of protections being granted to the major monopolies in such a way that they could go ahead and censor people and not lose a common carrier status and thereby lose the protections that should be afforded only to those who don't censor. During the 1980s, when I realized that the newspaper chains that were backing this early experiment did not want free exchange of ideas. In fact, they told me that my architecture, which promoted that, would not be acceptable as a strategy or as a value, because they saw the institutions as having a responsibility to edit the content that was going out to people rather than having people edit for each other the content. That's when I resigned. It became more important for me to participate in opening the space frontier, because I saw the space frontier as possibly being one of the only places where people could escape this kind of increasing tyranny of the mind. As a result of that, the Coalition for Science and Commerce came into existence to pass the Launch Service Purchase Act of 1990. We succeeded. I testified before Congress with the testimony title, Necessity and Incentives Opening the Space Frontier. In that testimony, I described the betrayal of the American people represented by NASA and the Apollo program, where the American people saw that as opening a frontier, but the people who were in charge of the centralized power saw it as a Cold War contest. Once won, it was over. This betrayal gave rise to a general negative-sum view of the world by the boomers. They went from people saying, well, do your own thing, to let's all get together and be communists or whatever, because we all had to struggle to try to find some place in a closed frontier, no place to go. So we all had to start giving up pioneer values and start trying to climb on top of each other. And this deeply corrupted the boomer generation and subsequent generations as well. The law that we passed required NASA to procure from the private sector space launch services. Once we got the law passed, I went and became vice president of public affairs for E-Prime Aerospace, which had acquired from the Reagan administration the production lines for the MX missile, also called the Peacekeeper missile. It was a very good system for delivering warheads, but it also had some good operational characteristics for commercial launch. When I was involved with that company, I was also involved in talking to other people like Gary Hudson and others who were interested in starting space launch services. I became very aware of the problems in raising capital. And since I had been important in making the government and society in general reliant on private capital for capitalizing space launch services, and I considered space launch services crucial in opening the space frontier, I had a responsibility to start looking very critically at the way capital markets operate. Given the fact that I had a bad experience with Wall Street and Bill Norris and control that corporation, I was, let's say, skeptical of the way capital markets operated and began investigating what went wrong with capital markets. I was also at the same time having to make some very hard personal decisions about being able to start a family due to the rapidly increasing cost of real estate and the lagging income, especially something that Elizabeth Warren calls the two-income trap, affecting the boomers that caused a drop-off in fertility rates as well as stability in families. So my research on that led to a proposal to replace the existing tax system, the 16th Amendment, with a single tax on liquidation value of net assets, a wealth tax. This sounds like Elizabeth Warren, but she wanted to lard on the existing tax system a new tax. So it would be a complication. There would be no relief from the income tax. That's something that I warned against in 1992 when I proposed this as a solution to the capitalization problem for launch services. As time went on, it became apparent that there was not going to be much attention paid to this kind of reform. I brought it up to Brookings Institute, and their chief economist at the time, I can't remember, it was Henry Aaron, I believe, did say that it was a tremendous public service I was doing to try to promote this kind of reform. The reform also included a replacement of the welfare state with what we now call an unconditional basic income, which I would call it more a citizen's dividend. But as time went on, it became apparent that there wasn't going to be a functioning capital market unless something drastic happened to shake capital loose from Wall Street. That opportunity came with the dot-com bubble. Fortunately, out of that bubble, there was some capital that was shaken loose from Wall Street. And so some positive sum thinkers actually got into the game of network monopolies. One of the network monopolies was PayPal. Another network monopoly was Amazon. And you could backtrack a bit to Miami and the Miami Herald AT&T Nat Ritter experiment in 1982 and 1983. When I was in Miami in 1982, I was the senior associate for Space Studies Institute. I was the local support team leader, promoting the ideas of Gerard O'Neill in Miami. At the time, I was unaware that the valedictorian of Miami High School was interested in space colonization. I don't know whether I had any influence on this valedictorian or not, but it was my job to promote O'Neill's vision in Miami. And we were able to do so via various media outlets, That valedictorian was Jeff Bezos. I believe that Jeff Bezos was already aware of Gerard O'Neill's vision from a television interview with Isaac Asimov. So it's just kind of an interesting coincidence that that occurred, although it may just be a coincidence and nothing more. Nevertheless, around the year 2000, when the dot-com bubble burst, there were some survivors that had managed to get into place network effects. As I said, PayPal was one, Amazon was another one. Both Bezos and Musk became wealthy from those network effects. Monopolies. The kinds of monopolies that I was concerned about originally becoming unregulated and therefore a potential source of censorship. Both Musk and Bezos then went on to develop their own launch systems. Musk, being a physicist, was more successful, and he actually placed more of his capital at risk in doing technology development rather than furthering network effect wealth, which is the kind of wealth that makes it so that you are benefiting from the tax structure as it stands that causes the capital market failures. So Musk was actually developing technology that was crucial to opening the space frontier in a more effective way than was Bezos. It's a lie, a really vicious lie, that Musk has been the beneficiary of space technology developed by the government. He is far less a beneficiary of that kind of technology transfer than almost all of the other space launch providers. He is far more in line with the spirit of the law that we passed in 1990. Bezos, not quite as much, but still Bezos is superior to the other launch service providers in terms of capitalization and risk taking. It's just that Musk is more so. Under the tax reform that I set forth, Musk would be far wealthier than he is now, and Bezos would be far less wealthy, although Bezos would still be wealthier than the vast majority of the people who are part of the capital market failure structure that's built in the United States. Now, having said all that, when we approached the year 2015, the pervasive influence of social media had grown to the point that people were actually getting back in touch with their high school friends. Boomers were getting in touch with their high school friends via Facebook. And there was a general change in the culture that was really taking place, somewhat malign in some ways, pathological, but on the other hand, it was starting to realize what I predicted in 1982 was going to happen with the settler culture. But the settler culture was, of course, greatly debilitated by the negative sum view of the world that had been imposed by the central authorities in Wall Street and their preferences for culture, centralizing population in cities and making it so that families would have a hard time having children because they would not have sufficient security. They would not even have as much security as their parents had had with one income in the family. This is described in great detail by Elizabeth Warren's book, The Two-Income Trap. And there's a video that she has online that's worth viewing that goes into some detail about this. But she doesn't really address in a very direct way what I see as the definition of inflation that should be in place by any humane government, which is the cost of replacement reproduction. You need to measure the cost of replacement reproduction in terms of the middle class. If you don't do that, then you are effectively committing genocide against your population. So Elizabeth Warren was about the best that we've had in the Ivy League in terms of defending the family. And even so, she fell far short of what was necessary. That being said, she was drawn into politics where she should have, especially during the time she was drawn in the wake of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009. She should have been promoting policies along the lines that I had suggested back in 1992 to fix the capital markets and support the families. What she did instead was focused on peripheral issues, and then she got drawn into identity politics in her presidential campaign. She suggested a wealth tax, but it was larded on top of the existing tax system. It's not the right way to do it at all. She could have won the presidential election if she had simply replaced the 16th Amendment with a wealth tax. But she has, I'll say, incompetent advisors. Her campaigns are really symptomatic of the inability of the political system to address the needs of the nation of settlers. When Trump came along and said Mexican rapists, everybody remembers that. And the reason is because for going on 50 years since the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, more than a supermajority of the American people had opposed the manifest policy of immigration, of ever increasing immigration rates over that period. Up until the year 2000, over 90% of the people opposed the policy of increasing immigration rates. The year 2000, it became more like 80%, 75%. And this could be attributed to the fact that there was a changing constituency in the United States that was changing the culture from a settler culture to a nation of immigrants, which is the idiom that JFK, serving as a front for the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, popularized. But the nation of settlers is the true foundation of the United States. And it would be the true foundation of any kind of space settlement culture in the future. So when the social networks began to align themselves and provide support, massive support for Trump, because he mentioned the malign effects of immigration after the people had been ignored for decades, almost 50 years, it created an explosion. You can't have legitimate institutions that ignore the will of the vast majority of the people, more than a supermajority of the people, more than 90% of the people, on an issue that replaces the people. You can't have that kind of a political system and claim that you've got any kind of legitimacy in your institutions. And the people in power who had clamored for those positions of power were the kinds of people that were the enemies of the people. And they understood that at some level, they were betraying the trust of the people. They were not there legitimately. The political system had failed. It wasn't that the immigration system was broken. The political system was broken. And I saw that. I mean, we succeeded in passing that law to privatize space launch services, but it was a bloodletting. The people who did not have a direct stake in the outcome of that, the people who were grassroots volunteers that were part of our coalition, made serious sacrifices. And when we saw how the sausage was made, I mean, it was apparent to me that we were in a vicious cycle that was feeding on itself at this national level. So it shouldn't be too surprising that when Trump broke ranks with that malign pattern, that structural defect in the legitimacy of our institutions, that all hell broke loose. The Russian narrative was simply a way of avoiding facing the fact that immigration had delegitimized the American institutions, replacing the settler culture that was positive sum with a nation of immigrants culture that was essentially a takeover of territory. When that happened, the network effect monopolies in Silicon Valley became the focal point of containing the damage on behalf of these people who had taken over and occupied the culture of the United States. That's when they began censoring in earnest. And that's when they began fulfilling my warning in the 1982 essay, Videotex and the American Pioneer, that there's a danger, a tremendous danger, I called it, that deregulation would be pursued to the extent that natural monopolies would start censoring people, and that we'd be back in the same state that we were in, where we had a few television networks, major newspapers, etc., that controlled thought. Once they started doing that, the stage was set for not just the 2020 election, where you had, for example, Hunter Biden's laptop story censored by Twitter so that Biden would be elected. But you had a general air that if you did not align yourself with whatever it was that these, I called them in 1982, feudalists. Now I would tend to see more along the lines of rent seekers, or it's really a culture that's a negative sum, trying to climb on top of each other. If you don't align yourself with whatever they're saying you should believe, then you're in danger of your livelihood. You could lose your job, and most of the Fortune 500 was in control of this kind of mentality. So you had to align. Once you're in that state, you have a problem where swarms can form, like eusocial insects, ant colonies, bees, where they can move around based upon just seeing, smelling almost, pheromones in their environment. That starts happening, and you have uncontrolled attacks on alarm pheromone stigma. So you've got somebody who's accused of being a white supremacist, or you've got, in the case of Trump, he was stigmatized as being a Russian puppet, as a way of avoiding talking about the failure of the political system and immigration. So we had this swarming behavior that was being rewarded by the institutions, the network monopolies, even as the old mass media, legacy mass media, was being essentially written off. Once we were in that kind of situation, it's very dangerous because you don't have any controls on what this massive swarm might do. And in fact, in eusocial insects, they're warlike organizations. So if you have, say, an attempt by the nation of settlers to swarm to defend themselves, I mean, they aren't going to be as prone to swarming behavior because they're much more independent and individualistic. I mean, that's a widely accepted fact in social psychology that Americans are very individualistic, and that's primarily the settler culture. So they're not nearly as likely to swarm, but they are accused of being likely to swarm by the swarmers. So we're now in a situation where we've been swarming about Russia, and Twitter was one of the places where this was promoted. And one of the things about the Hunter laptop disinformation that was put forth is that it was Russian disinformation. What in fact it was a potential exposure of Chinese influence and also involvement in Ukraine. The swarm that we're now dealing with Ukraine was set in motion during the reaction to the election of Trump, which was itself an attempt to cover up the illegitimacy of Western institutions regarding immigration. For us to de escalate the confrontation with Russia is going to take something that takes the swarm that's currently in place as a reaction to Trump's election and redirect it somewhere else, because these people are no longer in control of their own faculties. They feel like they have to join the swarm and demonstrate to others that they're part of the swarm to be safe from reprisal. When Musk came in and attempted to restore some semblance of freedom that we saw in the early internet, it was obviously an existential threat to certain aspects of this swarming behavior. But I believe it's too late. Because the swarms don't have an ability to turn themselves off. Even if you free up speech so that people can talk about alternatives to Russia or Putin as the source of all evil, it's not going to prevent the swarm from continuing on its present course. It could have been prevented if the 2020 election had been fair, but it wasn't. So now we're facing a very serious situation. The primary value that we have in something like Twitter is that we can try to, once again, contact each other, the pioneer Americans, the settler culture. And although people criticize Musk as a Boer, apartheid, whatever, or claim that he's an immigrant, he's really part of a pioneer culture, part of a settler culture. That's why he's doing what he's doing. We have an opportunity to use the new freedoms to try to address the potential catastrophe that's upon us. It's not clear that there's anything we can do to avert it. If you look at John Robb's analysis, he's a military theoretician. He talks about swarms. I'm sort of borrowing a lot of his ideas here because he is, I believe, one of the more prescient of the military theoreticians. His view is that we are in a situation where all of the people that are of this kind of zero-sum mentality that have taken over the Western institutions are competing with each other to outdo each other and gain social status and attacking Putin. And there's no one Putin can negotiate with to de-escalate. There's only a bunch of what might be called mean girls of all sexes and ages that are competing for status, being more popular in a very shallow sense, but they have their fingers on the buttons. So we need to start using what freedom we have to communicate to say, what do we do in the event of nuclear war? And this is a higher priority than it's been for a very long time. If Bill Norris, a controlled data corporation, had not been attacked by the Wall Street financial press, and we'd been allowed to apply the Plato Network's technologies to decentralizing population back to the land with artisanal homesteads and formed families, it'd be a different, very different world with far less vulnerability to nuclear weapons and far more robust social order. So this is not very good news. It's not very cheerful. And Trump is not really going to be able to do much about it, even if he's reelected. But we have, I think, a debt to Elon Musk. He couldn't have bought in any sooner than he did because Tesla's market cap was not high enough back in 2019 for him to be able to buy Twitter at its market cap. So he did about as much as he could, although he could have come out and support my tax reform very early on, and he should have. That's one thing I can fault him for, but that's water under the bridge. Anyway, thanks for listening.